What's up everybody, Sven Diesel here. We're going to be tying up the poly stimulator. This is basically a stimulator fly pattern where we're going to be using a new product by Semperfli, their floating poly yarn, as the underbody. We're going to be using an Ahrex FW531. This is a size 8. I really love this hook for stimulators. So let's go ahead and get started. We have on some yellow goldish thread here, and we're going to go ahead and start a little bit behind the hook eye, and I'm just going to work my way down the bend of this hook to lay down a nice thread base before we add our first main material, and that is the tail. So for the tail and wing, we're going to be using this stimulator deer hair. This is a product I didn't know existed until not too long ago, and I absolutely love it for stimulators. It is a little bit longer in length, and so I can do some bigger stimulators, like in sizes down to 4s and 2s. But we're gonna cut out a good chunk of hair here, roughly, I don't know, what is that, 25 butt ends that we see, and I'm going to kind of pull with my fingers. You can use a comb if you want the under fur out and get any of those shorter hairs in. I don't really want those, and I'll reposition myself, mainly grabbing the tips now. So we're down to about 20 hairs, and so then we'll go ahead and throw it in a little small hair stacker. Probably the smallest one you have might be sufficient, and you want to have a little bit of space in there so they move around. We'll go ahead and stack those, pinch it, and then I'm going to let that go back roughly the hook gap, and then we'll go ahead and do a couple loose wraps as I'm working my way up and around this, trying to get that the hair to stay on top of the hook shank. And these loose wraps, we're going to wrap over and tighten them again. But as we get up here about to the halfway, maybe a little bit past the halfway point of the shank, I'm going to go ahead and tie that off and then wrap backwards down. And then the key is, you're good if you can get this all out in one snip. And I'll just pull them all up, and you can see I'm not that good. Got a few stragglers there. Be careful not to cut your thread at that point. And now we're going to clean up this hair, and back here at the back I'm going to go do some over-unders, and what that does is it kind of fans out the tail a little bit. And so as I'm coming up and over, I don't want to pull down too hard, but we're using that over-under to pinch it back and create kind of a rear fan in the tail. And then we'll just clean up this this body. We're not going to be using floss or tinsel for this body, so it doesn't have to be perfect. We're going to be using this floating poly yarn, and this is the color tan. This is a new product by Semperfli. Poly yarn's been around. I don't know their trick to call it the floating poly yarn, what it's treated with, but this stuff, the color combos are just amazing. And so this is the brand new. We're going to kind of trim off the fuzzy end, and I'll just do a nice pinch wrap there, keeping this poly yarn on the top of the hook shank. And then as we get back here towards the back, I'm going to leave about a full wrap's length between the tail ending and the poly yarn being tied off there. And next we're going to tie in some 0.1 millimeter fine wire by Semperfli. This is in the color gold, and I've seen a lot of Hackle body flies where people don't use the wire or tippet, and to be honest, that's what actually got me into fly tying. Was I kept having elk hair caddisses, the hackle become undone, and it was super frustrating because once it came undone, it didn't float as good, and it didn't seem to catch as many fish. So speaking of hackle, this is what we're going to be using by Whiting Farms. This is a really unique color. It is a natural dun. It's one of my more favorite pieces of hackle that I own, and we're just going to tie it in here towards the rear. I'm going to prep it by pulling off some of the fibers, and I'm going to tie it in so that my first wrap, so the hackle fibers are concaving towards the tail at this point, and then we'll go ahead and work our thread up to the roughly the 7/64. No, I'm kidding. I'm not very good with fractions, but I'm just going to do a little half hitch, and I kind of foobarred that one, but just to kind of keep my thread there out of place. Now the first material we're going to wrap up there is the floating yarn, and this first wrap is kind of critical. I want to wrap over everything, but not like trapping that tail fiber to kind of move it around, because we already got it positioned. And I'm doing touching wraps, but then as I get up here where I want to thicken the body, I'm kind of overlapping the wrap slightly. and we're going to end it here, and I kind of want to get a little bit thicker there, so I'll wrap back over it again and then end it right there, so we have a nice little step up for our wing. And so we'll go ahead and tie that off with a few wraps behind and a few wraps in front and trim it out. And if you got a little tag in, that's okay too, because we're going to be covering it up. Next comes the hackle, and you can counter rib this, but more importantly, you want to make sure that this hackle is orienting correctly as you come around. We want it concaving so it's going back towards the tail, and so I'm just going to kind of not follow the grooves of the poly yarn, but kind of make my own. And you can see this is why I like this hackle. It's got that dark stem, and so it looks really, really cool, almost like we ribbed it with a darker wire. And then we'll get up here to where our wing is going to be, and we'll go ahead and tie that off with some wraps behind and a wrap in front of it again, and just secure that down and trim it so that we're not going to have it slip out. And like I said, what got me into fly tying was making a more durable fly, and we're going to go ahead and take this 1.1 millimeter wire now, and I'm going to advance my thread up a little bit, and I'm just going to use my rotary function on my vise and kind of zigzag it in between, wrapping opposite of our hackle called a counter rib. And that way, say a fish bites this body, the hackle's not going to come undone because this wire is holding it in place, unless, for example, you catch that 38-inch rainbow stock trout that has teeth like you've never seen, and they bite that wire. This isn't bulletproof, but it's pretty good. And notice how I just let my when using the rotary, I just let the bobbin wrap around, and I just undid those wraps, and then we secured our wire, and that is the rear section of our fly, and it looks amazing. You can go ahead and pick out any of those tracked hackle fibers, but I'm just going to move on and get the CDC. And this is some bulk CDC from Montana Fly Company in the color yellow. And I love these gold body orange head stimulators. And what we're going to do with this CDC is I'm going to take 2 or 3 feathers, and I'm going to kind of stack them and orient them, and then trim the very, very tips out so that we're not getting the stem all the way back, because these have a little bit of a thicker stem. And then I'm just going to tie them in with about 3 loose wraps and then pull it to length. So I want it to go roughly so that the longest fibers are going to the end of my tail, but that the bulk is going just mainly the body of the where we tied the poly yarn, if that makes sense. And you're going to have the stem in there, but in all honesty, it's going to help benefit the wing, and also give a little bit more structure and help the CDC, in my opinion. So I wanted a little bit thicker of an underwing, and so we're going to do 2 more CDC feathers in the same process. I just trimmed out the tips. I'm going to lay them on top, do 2 to 3 loose wraps, and then pull it to length to match up to our existing length of our other CDC. And you can see when I pull my hands away right here, you can see that hackle stem is kind of going a little bit, halfway down the body. Not super spooky for fish, in my opinion, but if it bothers you, you could. There's a lot of different ways you could attach that CDC here for that purpose. But the next step is we're going to take a clump of that stimulator deer hair, and I'm going to go roughly double the amount that we did for the tail. I always try to do it in whenever I'm tying flies, I try to find proportions that I can use for any hook size. And so, if I always just double the wing in relation to the tail, and that's how I do it. So we're going to do the same thing, clean it up, and I'm going to put it in the hair stacker. I think the original stimulator is an unstacked wing, but I like to stack them, and I'm not perfect at it, so technically it's still unstacked. But we want it to be good, and I'm going to orient that so that, say I push that wing all the way down, it's going to match up almost to the tip of the tail, just a little bit short. And I'm going to do 2 loose wraps, pull up, and then I'm going to pull about a third of that butt end section, and I'm going to do some forward wrapping wraps, and then on the last one I'm going to flare it, and then I'm going to do the same process again, do 2 to 3 wraps as I advance forward towards the hook eye, and then I will try and trap all those fibers on top, and then I will flare it again, and then I'll just kind of orient all those up and then do a few wraps in front of it. And what we just did is we secured that deer hair in segments, which helps make it a little bit more durable, and also really helps to form the cone of this fly. And you could pre-cut your butt ends, but then you wouldn't be able to do what I just did. But there's other ways around that. You could put a little bit of head cement in there to hold this in place and whatnot, but you can see that was not super difficult, and I really like the ability to manipulate that cone. And so we'll go ahead and just use some really tight snug wraps right here, cleaning this up. But as we get back towards the wing, you got to be careful, because if you snug wrap it, it's going to reverse flare those fibers to kind of stand up and flare out. And so I'm just doing some looser wraps right there. And the further you want your wing to lay down, at this point you wrap further back. I like it to stick up at roughly a 19.5 degree angle. We're going to use the same hackle that we used for the rear. I know some guys that will step it up a size. However, I think that because we've added that much more bulk to the shank, I think it actually does. And we're going to switch colors. I'm going to do a hot head, which means a bright color, and we're going with the sunburst orange in the same floating poly yarn. And this stuff's really cool. I thought it'd be an issue because I've always used dubbing or other things, but it really complements this pattern, especially, or when wrapping hackle over it. I thought it'd be a little bit more difficult, but it kind of, when doing some tighter wraps there, it kind of creates almost a uniform body. And for the head here, I'm actually going to use these grooves to kind of orient my hackle. And so we're just going to wrap that hackle down through the in-between sections of this floating poly yarn. So make sure you don't overlap your wraps. Just butt them in right next to each other. And we're going to take this and orient it so that those hackle fibers are going backwards. And this first wrap, I'm going to kind of do skip up onto that first little lip, and then I'm going to come on the next one and the next one and all the way till the eye. And we're actually counter ribbing the poly yarn, so on the other side it's not going to look near as pretty as this side, but I like it a lot. I evenly spaced it. That's money right there. So we're going to do some hackle wraps, some securing wraps behind and in front, and trim that out. And then just make sure at this point you don't cut this so short that it slips out from your thread, or don't knock your thread off. A lot of times I'll whip finish before trimming it out, but we're going to go ahead and just be super gentle, and I'm going to abuse these hackle fibers, and we'll go ahead and whip finish right there in front. And sometimes if they're in your way, just go ahead and use your fingers and kind of cone it back. But we're going to do a double whip finish, and then of course we're going to secure the head here with a little bit of UV resin. You could use head cement if you're more comfortable with that, or super glue if you like waiting a while for it to dry. I like the UV because it cures, and I can throw it in my fly pile. So we're going to go ahead and pull those hackle fibers back. I'm going to apply it to the sides here. Be a little bit careful when doing this that you don't get UV resin into the hook eye. If you're not comfortable using this brush tip, you could always apply a little bit to a bodkin and just rub it across. And we'll go ahead and cure that up for 10 to 15 seconds. And that right there is a fishy fly. It mimics a few different insects on the water. Anything, it could be a super large elk hair caddis, grasshopper. I add legs to them sometimes. It could be a bunch of different fly patterns out there, and so I really like it. It floats really well. You could dress it with some floating, but tie some up in your favorite colors and go ahead and fish them and pierce some lips. Thanks for watching.